Imagine two projects. Same building, same broad location, same competent team, same basic materials. One looks like it should cost an amount, the other comes back costing something completely different. And the first reaction is usually quite natural. Someone looks at the numbers and says, "Where has all the money gone?" Because from the outside, construction costs should be fairly easy to understand. Well, you have labor, right? Add materials, plant design costs, management costs. You add it all up, you build the bloody thing, but that is not really how modern construction works anymore. Not fully. Because the cost of a project is not only the cost of the building, it is the cost of the environment required to allow the building to exist. And that environment is not small. Planning, legal structures, insurance, finance, program management, risk allocation, consultants, reporting, compliance, governance, approval, stakeholder management, procurement, delays, rework, contingency. And the slightly uncomfortable truth is this. None of those things are necessarily wrong. Most of them exist for good reasons. They protect people, they protect capital, they protect public interest. And they reduce exposure. They make risk visible and they create confidence. But together, they create something that is very easy to underestimate. They create system cost. And once you start seeing that, the question changes. It stops being only, why is construction so expensive? And becomes, what exactly are we paying for? People make projects that bring profits. But profits decide which projects get built and what people become because of them. This is Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. I'm Piotr Bytnar, founder of Bytnar Limited, a chartered structural engineering practice founded in 2017. At Bytnar, we work around projects where technical decisions, commercial pressure and delivery reality and client confidence all meet. And that is a useful place to stand when talking about cost. Because cost is one of those words that sound simple until you sit close to it. A client sees cost as viability. A contractor sees cost as exposure. A designer sees cost as consequence. A QS sees cost as movement. A funder sees cost as risk. A planner sees cost as process. A project manager sees cost as the thing that keeps changing while everyone is trying to keep the project under control. So true. Same number, different meanings. And that is why the episode matters. Because when people talk about UK construction being expensive, the conversation often becomes too narrow too quickly. Someone blames contractors, someone blames consultants, someone blames planning, someone blames regulation, some other people blame materials, cost, some people blame labor, some people blame clients changing their mind. And to be fair, each of these explanations can be true in a particular project and from the particular point of view. There are inefficient projects, there are poor designs, there are weak scopes, indeed. There are bad procurement decisions, there are overloaded teams, there are delays that should not have happened. There are commercial behaviors that make everything harder than it needs to be. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper structure, because sometimes high cost is not just the result of people doing things badly. Sometimes high cost is the result of the system doing exactly what it has been designed to do. Protect against risk. Slow decisions down until enough people are comfortable. Create paper trails, allocate liability, satisfy funders. Preserve optionality. Defend against failure. And that is a very different conversation, isn't it? Because if the system has been optimized for protection, certainty and risk transfer, we should not be surprised when it becomes expensive. That is the cost puzzle. Not just the cost of building, the cost of making building possible inside a complex, cautious, financially structured environment. You see, the visible cost is rarely the whole cost. Most people recognize visible construction cost. That's an easy thing to see. Anyone with a calculator can figure this one out. You can see the materials arriving, you can see labor on site, you can see plant moving, you can see scaffolding going up, you can see concrete poured, steel erected, brick laid, windows fitted. So when the budget rises, people naturally look at the visible things first. Did materials go up? Did labor become more expensive? Did the contractor price too high? Was the design inefficient? Is the program too long? And all of that matters? Of course it does. If steel increased in cost, the job feels it. If labor is short, the job feels it. If materials are delayed, the job feels it. If design is unclear, the job feels it. But on many projects, the visible cost is only the surface layer. There is another cost sitting around the project, and it begins long before anyone starts building. It starts with land, then planning, then feasibility, then surveys, then early advice, then environmental consideration, then legal structure, then funding assumptions, then risk allowance, then procurement routes, then consultant appointments, then reporting expectations, then insurance requirements, then governance, then approvals, then redesign, then more advice, then tender clarification, then exclusions, then negotiations. Whoa, I'm getting out of breath here. And slowly, the project begins carrying costs before it has physically become anything. And that's not a small cost. And the biggest one of them is time. Well, when nothing is being built yet, but the money is ticking, but the meter is running. That is the part people often underestimate. A project can become expensive before construction begins. Not because someone is wasting money in an obvious way, but because the system is asking for more certainty before it allows commitment. And certainty is expensive. You do not get certainty by hoping. You get it through surveys, reports, advice, modeling, checks, reviews, contracts, insurance and governance. And each of those layers has a purpose. That is the difficult part, because it is not as simple as saying, remove the consultants, or cut the paperwork, or just let builders build. That may sound attractive until something goes wrong. Then everyone asks why the checks were not done. Why the risk was not identified, why the liability was not clear, why the funder was not protected, why the public interest was not considered, why the design was not reviewed, why the warning signs were missed. So we have built a system that tries to see more, protect more, and allocate more. And that brings a kind of maturity, but it also brings weight. At Bytnar, that is usually where we become quite careful with the conversation. Because if you only attack costs at the visible layer, at the visible level, you can end up pushing pressure into the wrong place. Like just trying to push all the projects and planning and all the rest as quickly as possible through the system just to find out that you can build something that may be highly unoptimized. You reduce a fee here, you compress a program there, you shift risk into the contractor, you ask for a sharper number, you remove some early investigation, and for a moment the budget looks better. But the uncertainty has not disappeared, has it? It has just moved to the future. And moved uncertainty has a habit of coming back later with interest. It's like that snowball going down the snowy hill. That is one of the quiet patterns in construction. Cost does not always vanish when you cut it. Sometimes it hides. Well, most of the times it hides and it gathers momentum. A small skip at the beginning, getting quicker and faster, moving, getting more and more momentum through the system, through the process, gets so fast that when it hits you, well, sometimes it gets you under the ground with your business. Well, there is that invisible layer, and it's hard to see unless you go through the projects for years. In Bytnar, we nearly advised on around 1,000 projects by now, so we did see a lot, but there are still things that surprise us. Let's stay with this for a moment, all right? Think about a simple meal, like fish and chips. I think that metaphor will work quite well. You're not expecting a complicated invoice, do you? It's fish, potatoes, oil, labor, rent, a bit of margin, right? That feels understandable. But now imagine that before the meal reaches the table, several layers sit around it. A compliance review, a food safety inspection, a legal liability check, insurance conditions, a supply chain audit, a finance model, a brand standard, a procurement framework, a customer experience consultant. Each one can be justified. Nobody is necessarily being ridiculous here. Food safety matters, doesn't it? Insurance matters, liability matters, supply chain matters. But by the time the plate arrives, the cost no longer reflects only the food. It reflects the system required to serve the food safely, legally, predictably, and repeatedly. Construction has a similar invisible layer, only much larger. A building is never just a building. It is a legal object, a financial object, a planning object, an insurance object, a political object, a technical object, a commercial one for that matter, a future operational asset. And each identity creates work. That is where transaction density appears. More interfaces appear, more approvals, more meetings, more reports, more review points, more people needing confidence before decisions can move. And again, this does not mean the people involved are unnecessary. That would be too crude. The real issue is that every additional layer creates coordination demand. Someone has to connect the layers. Someone has to maintain the logic. Someone has to know whether the legal position still matches the technical reality. Someone has to know whether the design still matches the cost plan. Someone has to know whether the planning assumptions still match the program. Someone has to know whether the funder's requirements still match what can actually be built. Someone has to know whether risk has been understood, transferred, priced, or ignored, or simply parked. That coordination demand is rarely visible from the outside. But it is very real inside the project. You see it in meetings, a question is asked, the designer cannot answer without the cost consultant cannot answer without the contractor cannot answer without the supply chain, the client cannot decide without a funder, the funder needs legal comfort, the legal needs technical confirmation needs more information, and suddenly, what looked like one decision has become a small system and a small dance within the project team. That is not inefficiency in the simple sense, although very often it is. But it is certainly complexity, and complexity has carrying cost. The problem is that projects often do not budget properly for the capability needed to carry that complexity. Very often, all the different siloed companies don't have that capability of coordination and cooperation. Well, cooperation maybe, but coordination and understanding what all of the other points of view entail to play and dance with them nicely. The budget for roles, the budget for appointments, the budget for deliverables. Well, all of those people need to be paid somehow. All of those situations and processes, they are not being delivered for free. But they do not always build the connective capability between those roles. It's very rarely that there is such. Everyone's been trained in a different way. People generally don't have that propensity to learn forever. They want to have a trade, they want to have a specialism, they want to be closed in the cubicle and left alone and be paid at the end of the month, don't they? Many do. But construction and project delivery on the life sites, live projects is completely different kind of fish, kind of tuna. Maybe it's not a kind of tuna, maybe it's kind of sardines. Before you open it, you never know. Everyone is busy on construction sites. Everyone is producing something. But the project still struggles to think as one coherent system, doesn't it? We find it very often. And that is where cost starts to drift. Well, I think cost starts to drift before that as well, but when there is a misunderstanding and we start figuring things out on the live construction site, it certainly drifts then. Not dramatically at first. very often quietly at the beginning. A delayed decision here, a revised drawing, a missed interface, a tender clarification, a risk allowance added because the answer was not clear enough. These are the usual things that start the ball rolling down the hill on construction site. Or a meeting that ends with actions but not confidence. That is usually where cost begins to move. Not because nobody cares, because the project has become more complex than its coordination environment can comfortably absorb. That is a very Bytnar way of looking at costs. Not only what is the number, but what kind of system produces this number. Because the number is usually the final expression of a much earlier environment. You see, there is plenty of risk hidden in between all of those interfaces and in one specialism's delivery process too. And that risk becomes material very often at different places. There is a line I think is worth sitting with. That the risk does not disappear. It gets priced. And that changes how you look at construction cost if you treat it this way. Because we often talk about risk as if it is something we can allocate away. Silly thinking, isn't it? The client carries this. Ultimately, the contractor carries that. The designer carries this. The insurance carries that. The subcontractor carries a portion of it. The funder has protections. The operator has requirements. The contract defines responsibility, doesn't it? And on paper, the risk has been allocated. But the project still has the risk. It didn't disappear. Ground conditions are still uncertain. Interfaces still need work. Weather can still affect progress. Design decision can still create consequences. Market prices can still move. Approvals can still take longer. People can still misunderstand each other. And that's more often than not. The physical world does not become less uncertain just because the contract has become more precise. What changes is who has to carry the uncertainty. And whoever carries it will price it. A contractor carrying more risk will add contingency or exclusions. An insurer seeing more exposure will charge premium or restrict cover. A funder seeing uncertainty will want stronger conditions or a higher return. A client seeing uncertain scope may hold back commitment. A consultant seeing unclear responsibility will protect their position. Everyone responds rationally from where they stand, but collectively, the project becomes heavier. That is the strange thing about risk transfer. From one perspective, it creates clarity. From another, it creates cost. And from delivery level, it can create behaviors that look defensive but are often completely predictable. People become careful with language, emails become longer, meetings become more formal, contract notices appear earlier, commercial teams start asking different questions. Technical advice becomes more qualified. The contractor's price begins carrying risks that may or may not happen. The client begins paying for uncertainty because the project environment has not made that uncertainty visible enough to remove it. Or even worse, it made it visible, thinking of the worst case scenario, and then your project pays for it even though the conditions did not appear. This is where cost and trust meet. Because where trust is strong, risk can sometimes be held more intelligently. Not ignored, obviously, not casually accepted, but worked through. Where trust is weak, risk becomes harder, sharper and more expensive. And it's not only really about trust, it's competence, capability and trust. Because you can trust one another, but if you don't really know what you're doing, that trust is useless. Everyone needs protection at the end of the day. Everyone needs evidence. Everyone needs the position secured. Again, that is not necessarily wrong. It is just costly. And when you multiply that across a project, risks start behaving like a material. You know, that concrete has a cost. Well, so does steel, labor, but uncertainty has a cost also. And in some projects, uncertainty becomes one of the most expensive materials in the building. And it can be quantify, or maybe multiply by people standing around scratching their heads while the time goes. Well, the real question is whether the project is actually reducing risk or simply passing it around in a way that makes everybody price it. And that distinction really matters. Because a project can look well protected and still be very exposed. It can have contracts, insurances, reports, trackers, dashboards, and governance meetings. In fact, most of those projects do, especially the ones that are being run by professional consulting companies, but still not have real visibility. Yes, just because someone manages the process, someone manages the contracts, doesn't really mean that everything is visible. You can see that sometimes in project conversations, you see. The paperwork says the risk has an owner, but the owner doesn't know what he's doing. And in the room, people still do not quite know who is actually resolving it. And you know why? Because no one really knows how. The gap is expensive. Because uncertainty that is administered but not resolved tends to return as cost later. At Bytnar, a lot of useful work sits in that gap. Not making grand claims, just helping teams see where technical uncertainty, coordination uncertainty, and commercial uncertainty are becoming mixed together. Very often, the proverbial fishes are hitting the fan when you deal with design and construct contractor and then NEC contracts, or any other contract for that matter. But the true fact is of the matter that contractor doesn't actually have design capability. They subcontract all of that. So they're not really a design and construct company, but typical contractor that just gets the design subcontracted. And in that case, when you sit in the meeting and there are issues, no one can really answer them here and there. Or while they deliver the project, they cannot really look at the issue or anticipate some scenarios and be proactive in resolving them and be proactive in delivering the project. It's all more like a ping pong until you get to the bottom of the case, but then very often the bill for such a sometimes very minor issue can amount to thousands of pounds. Wow, someone has to charge for people standing around, right? You see, the uncertainty that is administered but not resolved really tends to cost later. Just helping teams see where technical uncertainty and coordination uncertainty and commercial uncertainties are becoming mixed together, that's where I usually sit. That's where I usually sit in a meeting, and I usually don't nod my head. I usually go and speak things up. Because there's no point of just having another meeting with no resolutions, is there? Because once those things are mixed, pricing becomes cautious as well. You see too many people with too many ideas, but not enough capacity behind all of that to actually see things through. So people do price cautiously. And that's a rational approach to be cautious about pricing of things that you don't quite understand, but you sort of know that it will hit you later on. And it's a natural occurrence. It's a natural part of being human. People are not being difficult here. They are reacting to the environment they've been put in. And then we go to the insurance multiplier of the whole cost. You see, insurance is one of those topics people often mention only when something becomes painful. You know, things like professional indemnity, public liability, contractors all risk, latent defects, performance bonds, parent company guarantees, collateral warranties. Each one sits somewhere in the protection architecture of a project. And probably you could think about several of others. And each one exists because failure has consequences. Design failure has consequences, site failure has consequences, fire safety failure has consequences, defects have consequences, contractor failure has consequences, operational failure has consequences, so the system builds protection. and it should. The Grenfell context alone changed how many people think about safety, responsibility, evidence, and assurance. Nobody serious should argue for a careless system, but protection still has a price, and the price is not only the premium. It is also the behavior created around the premium. When insurance is hard to obtain, design decisions become more cautious. When exclusions are broad, risk comes back into contracts. When liability is unclear, people spend more time defending responsibility. When cover is conditional, projects need more evidence. When funders want stronger protection, legal structure grows. When clients want long-term comfort, warranties and guarantees become part of the project landscape. And again, none of this is absurd. The difficult truth is that every layer may be responsible individually, reasonably, individually. But collectively, the project can become a machine for protecting against failure almost as much as machine for delivering the asset. That is the insurance multiplier, not simply insurance as a line item, insurance as a system behavior. It affects appointments, it affects design responsibility, it affects procurement, it affects contractor appetite, it affects who will take on what. It affects how much risk can be held by whom. It affects whether specialists are willing to sign up the obligations. And it affects time, because protection systems need review, documents need checking, liability needs aligning, policies need confirming, requirements need flowing down, and if any of the parts does not align, the whole decision slows. So when people ask why a project costs so much, sometimes part of the answer is because the project is carrying the cost of everyone needing to be protected from everyone else. That sounds blunt, I know, but it is not meant cynically. It is simply what happens when trust, liability, and capital all need formal structure. And the more fragmented the project environment becomes, the more each party needs its own protection. That is one of the reasons fragmentation is not only an operational issue, it is a cost issue. Every interface needs managing, every responsibility boundary needs defining, every gap needs protecting, and every protection layer adds friction. This is why capability matters so much. Because when technical capability, coordination capability, and decision capability are strong, you can reduce some uncertainty earlier. You can clarify scope. You can test assumptions. You can understand the interfaces. You can give funders and clients better visibility. You can help contractors price reality rather than fog. You can make risk more specific. Specific risk can be managed. Vague risk gets priced. That is very important decision, isn't it? The more vague the risk, the more expensive the project usually becomes. And then another point that I think is quite interesting and adds a lot to the cost of construction, and I call it the price of waiting. You see now, the time. Time is one of the most underestimated cost drivers in construction. Because when a project is waiting, it can look like nothing is happening, right? No site activity, no plant, no materials, no labor, no visible progress. But cost is still accumulating. Land still has a cost. Finance still has a cost. Teams still need to remain engaged. So that's a cost. Drawings may need updating. Cost. Surveys expire. Planning conditions change. Regulatory expectations move. Inflation affects future packages. Procurement windows shift, contractor availability changes, client confidence changes, and sometimes the market that made the project viable at the start is no longer the same market by the time the project is ready to move. That is the price of waiting. And in the UK, waiting is often built into the system. Planning approval, environmental review, consultations, legal challenges, gateway processes, funding approvals, internal governance, board decisions, procurement, technical review. Again, each stage can have a legitimate purpose. The issue is not that scrutiny exists. The issue is that time itself becomes a cost layer. And time does something slightly dangerous. It makes decisions feel safer in the moment, while making the project more expensive overall. Delaying a decision can feel prudent. More information, more review, more comfort, more alignment. But while the system seeks confidence, the project keeps absorbing costs. And when that happens repeatedly, delay becomes a financial structure. You see this in real conversations. A team says, we just need to wait for approval. Then, we need to refresh the cost plan. Then, we need to check the design against the latest requirement. Then, we need to re-engage the contractor. Then the market has moved, then original allowance no longer holds. And by that point, the cost increase looks like a construction problem. But some of it was born during waiting. This is why earlier visibility matters. Not because every decision should be rushed. Rushing creates its own cost. But because projects need to understand the cost of not deciding. That cost is often hidden. It sits in extended appointments, rework, inflation, opportunity cost, finance, uncertainty, and reduced market confidence. And the human side is important here. When projects wait too long, people become cautious. The language changes. Nobody wants to overcommit, do we? Nobody wants to own a number that may not survive. Nobody wants to promise a start date. Nobody wants to be the person who says the project is slipping before the official process admits it. So the project stays alive, but not fully moving. That state is expensive. There is a kind of half-life in projects where enough work continues to generate cost, but not enough certainty exists to generate progress. That is a very difficult place for clients and sponsors. Because from the outside it can look like professional activity, reports are being produced, meetings are happening, advice is being gathered, governance is functioning, but the project is not becoming more buildable at the same rate, it is becoming more expensive. That is where Bytnar lens becomes practical. To be honest, most of our best profit work is get it into the sites that are behaving this way and strengthening the team and straightening the things up. And here the question is not how do we skip the process, because usually the process is what it is, but there's not enough capacity and capability within the design or the actual construction team to move things forward. And that's why I and Bytnar, we are greatly placed in this place, and most of our best clients they know that we are well suited for this sort of circumstance. That's where we come into the site, strengthen things up, and release the time blockage. Release the bottleneck that costs thousands a day. Well, the question here usually is which parts of the process are genuinely reducing uncertainty and which parts are only circulating it. And a lot of them are circulating it. Because if a review does not clarify a decision, it may simply add time. If the report does not change understanding, it may simply add weight. If a meeting does not improve ownership, it may simply spread responsibility. And once responsibility spreads too thinly, decisions slow, cost follows that quietly. So that was the time. Time costs money. Time's money. Well, we all know that, right? And imagine that you have a site full of people and you wait for decisions. You can easily calculate that. You don't need AI to do it for you. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is global capital and financial architecture, because that costs money too. Money makes money. And that layer is easy to miss, because we concentrate on things that we build. But what allows them to be built is usually the global capital and financial architecture. You see, the UK is not only a place where buildings are built, it is also a place where assets are financed, structured, owned, traded and held inside wider investment logic. Well, we're one of the investment centers of the world, aren't we? So I think we're quite savvy with how we deal with money. Well, at least the City of London is. And that changes construction. Because once global capital enters the project, the building must satisfy more than physical performance. It must satisfy financial confidence, predictable returns, clear contracts, defined risk, stable governance, transparent reporting, an exit route from that investment, long-term liability structures, operational assumptions, due diligence, technical assurance, legal certainty. I've marked a lot of them here. None of those things are bricks, but all of them affect how bricks are paid for. This is where construction becomes financial architecture. A project may be engineered to stand up physically, but it is also engineered to stand up financially. That means more structure, more advice, more modeling, more review, evidence, scrutiny. And again, this brings benefits. Large projects become possible because capital has confidence. Infrastructure can be financed, assets can be developed. Long-term investment can enter the built environment. But capital does not arrive naturally. It brings expectations, and the project bends around those expectations. That affects procurement, reporting, risk appetite, which contractors are accepted. It also affects which warranties are needed and affects program certainty, how the project is governed, and it affects the cost of delay. That cost all of a sudden becomes major. And it also affects design decisions, sometimes quietly, because a technically sensible solution is not always the same as financially acceptable solution. A buildable solution is not always the same as foundable solution. A cheaper upfront decision is not always acceptable if it creates uncertainty later. And a more expensive system may be accepted if it reduces perceived risk. So the project is not only asking what is the best way to build this, it is also asking what will satisfy the capital structure around this. That is a very different question, and it explains why two projects that look similar physically can feel very different commercially. The building may look the same, the system around the building is not. One may have simple ownership, one may have complex funding, one may have lower reporting burden, one may have multiple stakeholders, one may have clearer planning status, one may be exposed to more regulatory uncertainty, and one may rely on a cautious insurer. One may require stronger warranties, and one may have tighter viability margins. Same bricks, different environment, different cost. At Bytnar, this is why we try not to separate technical advice from the commercial environment too neatly. Because the technical decision is rarely floating in isolation. It sits inside cost, risk, program, procurement, buildability, assurance, and I reckon confidence too. A drawing detail can carry commercial consequence. A coordination gap can affect finance. A delayed answer can change tender appetite. A poorly understood risk can become a price allowance. And once you see that, you stop treating cost as something that appears at the end. Cost is being created all the way through the project. Through assumptions, through timing, through clarity, through risk ownership, through the quality of decisions, through whether people understand the same reality early enough. The intellectual pivot is this inefficiency of the system, or is it its architecture? Maybe the question is not, is UK construction inefficient? Maybe the better question is, what has the system been optimized to do? Because every system produces the consequences of its priorities. If the system is optimized for speed, it will behave one way. If it is optimized for lowest first cost, it will behave another way. If it is optimized for risk transfer, it will behave another way too. If it is optimized for financial certainty, it will behave another way. If it is optimized for political accountability, public consultation, legal defensibility, and environmental scrutiny, it will behave another way. Most of the UK projects are a cocktail of all. And they very often shaken. Or no, maybe they actually stirred. The UK construction environment often carries many of those priorities at once. We want to build quickly, protect the public, protect capital, control risk, comply with regulations, satisfy stakeholders, minimize liability, maintain quality, respect planning, hit viability, avoid failure, show governance, keep everyone informed. That is a lot to ask of one system, and especially a system that's been assembled for every single project anew. And when a system is asked to satisfy many priorities simultaneously, it rarely becomes cheaper. It becomes more layered, more cautious, procedural, specialized, and expensive. This does not mean inefficiency is absent. There is inefficiency, a lot of it. There is poor coordination, there is waste, rework, bad scopes, weak leadership. There are procurement routes that transfer risk badly. There are meetings that achieve very little. There are reports that create comfort but not clarity. There are design decisions that should have been resolved earlier. There are contractors pricing uncertainty because the project has not matured enough. So yes, inefficiency exists, but inefficiency is not the only story. And if we call everything inefficiency, we miss architecture. The system has an architecture. It has layers, incentives, protections, its own behaviors, habits, fears, and its memory. The industry remembers failure. It remembers claims, collapses, safety tragedies, insolvencies. It remembers cost overruns. It remembers political scrutiny, judicial review, and it remembers projects that went wrong. And systems that remember failure often become systems that protect heavily against it. That is understandable, but it has a price. So when people say, why can't we just build? There is a fair frustration in that question. It rings in our ears. But the answer is not simple. Because society does not actually want construction with no protection. Capital does not want construction with no certainty. Clients do not want construction with unmanaged risk. Communities do not want development with no scrutiny. Insurers do not want exposure with no control. Contractors do not want obligations they cannot price. Designers do not want liability they cannot manage. So everyone asks for protection, and then everyone is surprised when protection becomes expensive. That is the puzzle. The cost is not always in the thing. It is in the conditions we require before the thing can happen. So, seeing all of those different costs, how do they move? Where do they actually move? Well, let's bring this down into the project room, okay? The client wants cost certainty. Completely reasonable. They ask for a fixed price. The contractor looks at the information. Some of it is clear, some of it is not. There are design gaps, there are planning conditions still open, there are interfaces not fully resolved. There may be building safety requirements, there may be supply chain uncertainty, there may be program pressure, there may be unclear ground risk. So the contractor has a choice. Price the uncertainty, exclude the uncertainty, qualify the uncertainty, or refuse the job. None of those choices are magic. If they price it, the client sees a higher tender. If they exclude it, the client does not have full certainty. If they qualify it, the contract negotiation becomes harder. If they walk away, the client has less market appetite. So the cost puzzle appears again. The client wants certainty because the project feels risky. The contractor prices risk because the project lacks certainty. The more certainty the client demands from an uncertain project, the more expensive the certainty becomes. That sounds obvious when you say it slowly. But it is missed all the time, because under pressure people want the number before the reality is ready to support the number. They need board approval, they need funding, they need program commitment, they need political confidence, they need stakeholder updates, they need something to report. They need the ballpark figure. And you know what's the magical thing with ballpark figure? Everyone's tried to tie you down to the ballpark figure once it was said aloud. So the project is asked to become certain earlier than it naturally can. And when that happens, someone pays. Usually through contingency or exclusions or delays or later variations or reduced quality or strain the relationships, or a contractor carrying risks they later have to defend commercially. That is why a cheap number can be a very expensive number. A low tender is not always a low-cost project. Sometimes it is just a project when uncertainty has been postponed. And postponing uncertainty can feel like progress until reality arrives and hits you in the face. That is where Bytnar spends a lot of attention, not on making everything pessimistic, not on slowing everything down, but on asking whether the project has enough maturity to support the decisions being made. And if stakeholders do not want to pay for the certainty, well, they don't gamble. And if they're gamblers, let them be. Well, the question is, usually, is the design mature enough? Are the interfaces understood? That's sort of questions I ask. Are the risks specific? Are the assumptions visible? Is the scope coherent? Is the procurement route aligned with the actual uncertainty? Or are people pricing the same project? Because if they're not, a cost certainty is mostly theater. The number exists, the confidence does not. And experienced people can feel that. And experienced people, when they're gamblers, they shoot in the middle, not really knowing why the cheapest is too cheap and the most expensive is too expensive. They may not say it loudly, though, but you can sense it in the room very often when those decisions are being made. The reporting says the budget is under control. Once they move with the project this way, the language says otherwise. People begin using phrases like subject to, assuming that, we'll need to confirm, pending approval on the basis that, we have allowed for, we have excluded, blah, blah, blah. That is not just technical wording, that is risk speaking. And risk speaking usually means cost is moving somewhere. It's usually moving towards the client. Soft costs are not soft when they control the project. Yeah. And that's another point that I wanted to make. The phrase soft costs can be misleading because it makes them sound gentle, optional, secondary, less real than concrete or steel. But many so-called soft costs control whether the hard costs can happen at all. Planning advice can control whether the project proceeds. Legal structure can control whether funding is released. Insurance can control whether appointments are acceptable. Governance can control whether decisions move. Cost consultancy can control whether viability survives. Program management can control whether interfaces are coordinated. Technical review can control whether risk is understood. These are not soft in consequence. They do not pour concrete, but they shape whether concrete can be poured. When it can be poured, who is willing to pour it and at what price? So when people look at project costs and say, why are there so many advisors? The more useful question is, what uncertainty is each advisor being asked to manage? Sometimes the answer is legitimate. Sometimes the answer reveals duplication. Sometimes it reveals fear. Sometimes it reveals lack of trust. Sometimes it reveals unclear ownership. But sometimes it reveals that the client organization does not have enough internal capability, so the project buys external capacity instead. That is a big distinction. Capacity and capability are not the same thing. You can appoint more people, that gives you capacity, but it does not automatically give you capability. Capability is the ability to understand what matters, connect decisions, connect them dots, absorb complexity and protect decisions quality under pressure. A project can have many advisors and still lack capability. That is uncomfortable, but you see it very often. There are meetings with 20 people where nobody quite owns the actual decision. There are reports with many pages but no clear operational consequence. There are trackers with many risks but no genuine reduction in uncertainty. There are consultant teams producing information faster than the project can interpret it. So the project becomes busy but not necessarily clearer. And busyness costs money. This is why cost reduction cannot only mean cutting advisors. Sometimes that makes things worse. The better question is, which roles are genuinely creating clarity? Which roles are duplicating protection? Which roles are compensating for missing client capability? Which roles are creating reports because nobody is comfortable making a decision? which roles are reducing uncertainty and which are simply documenting it. Because documentation is not the same as understanding. And understanding is what changes cost behavior. When the project understands itself better, risk can become more specific. When risk becomes specific, it can be managed. When it is managed, it does not need to be priced so broadly. That is the pathway. Not cheapness through pressure, cost confidence through clarity. Now, this very often brings us to the fact that cutting costs often create cost in return. There is that strange loop in projects. Cost pressure arrives, so the project cuts early work. Less investigation, less design development, less coordination, less technical review, less time to test assumptions, less money spent before commitment. I think that's UK Construction 101. On paper, that looks like discipline. Well, from the investor point of view, it sort of does, because you want to hear the numbers, but you don't want to pay for hearing the numbers, for the process of appearing at the numbers, do you? It's very often inexperienced and silly or gambling investors, that's the way they go. And on paper, it may look discipline, like comparing that cost and getting the number. And sometimes it is. Sometimes the ballpark figure is actually a bullseye. Sometimes. Nobody wants endless pre-construction drift, do we? Nobody wants analysis paralysis. But there is a threshold here. Cut too much early understanding and the project does not become cheaper. It becomes less visible. Then tenders price uncertainty, or they miss uncertainty, or they qualify uncertainty, or they carry uncertainty into delivery. And later the project pays through change, claims, delays, rework, or strained delivery. So the cost pressure that tried to reduce cost ends up creating costs. That is the feedback loop. It happens because the system sees early expenditure as cost, but does not always see lack of understanding as liability. A survey is visible cost, a review is visible cost, design coordination is visible cost, constructability advice is visible cost, but missing information is invisible until it becomes expensive. That is why some of the most important cost decisions are not made during tender. They are made when deciding how much reality the project is willing to understand before it commits. That line matters. Because if you go too far, you waste time and money trying to remove every uncertainty. That is impossible. But if you do too little, you push uncertainty into the most expensive part of the project. Delivery. Delivery is a bad place to discover fundamental uncertainty. Everything is more pressured there. Decisions are faster, options are fewer, people are committed, contracts are alive, program is visible, commercial positions are formed, trust is more fragile. So a problem that might have been a manageable conversation earlier become a costly event later. This is why earlier visibility is not a luxury. It is cost control. Not in the simplistic scene of cutting line items, in the deeper sense of protecting the project from expensive surprise. And this is very much the kind of thinking that sits behind Bytnar's work. Technical capability is not only about calculations and drawings. It is about helping the project understand consequences early enough for decisions to remain useful. Because late clarity is still clarity, but it is expensive clarity. And I will be totally honest here. This is the position that we like to in Bytnar, and I personally, that's the position when I really like to come into the play in the construction projects, because that's usually the place where we bring the most of the value. When those decisions costs in thousands or tens of thousands of pounds for every single day missed of indecision, well, then our fees for our expertise is best placed. The value is right there. But when we ask to evaluate and design project at the word get-go, well, the understanding of that cost is usually an unnecessary cost. Well, until the proverbial thing hits the fan. That is. And now, I think we'd like to move to something more personable, really, more human. Human behavior inside that cost pressure is very important. At the end of the day, it's not computers that design projects, that cost projects, that deliver projects and get profits out of projects, is there? You see that cost pressure changes people. Not because people become bad, because the environment changes what feels safe. When budgets tighten, people speak differently. Contractors become more careful, clients become more demanding, consultants qualify advice, QS teams ask sharper questions, project managers push for decisions, designers defend scope, specialists protect margins, everyone becomes more aware of exposure. The room changes. You can feel it. Early in the project, conversation can be open. Ideas move, options are discussed, people say, we could look at that, we can test it, that might work. Later, when cost pressure appears, language narrows. Who owns that? What that includes? Is that a change? What does the contract say? Has this been instructed? Where is the allowance? Again, this is not people becoming difficult, it is the system tightening around them. And once that happens, learning becomes harder, because everyone starts protecting position. That is one of the hidden costs of cost pressure. It reduces honesty. Not always dramatically, just subtly. Concerns are raised later, risks are softened, bad news is packed, options are narrowed. People become careful not to create liability by saying too much too early. And when that happens, the project loses one of its most valuable resources: early truth. Early truth is cheap compared with late truth, but early truth requires trust. It requires the environment to tolerate uncertainty without immediately punishing the messenger. That is hard in commercial projects, because money is real, margins are real, responsibility is real, liability is real, but without early truth, cost becomes performative. Everyone manages the number. Fewer people manage the reality producing the number. That is where trust starts eroding. And once trust erodes, the project becomes even more expensive to coordinate. We end up with more meetings, more records, more formalities, more checks, more approvals, more commercial friction. The system protects itself because relationship no longer can. That is not soft. That is cost. Yeah, so what an honest cost conversation would sound like? So what do we do with all of this? No neat solution here, really. Not a motivational answer. Just a more honest conversation is needed. An honest cost conversation would not begin with, how do we make this cheaper? It might begin with, what is making this expensive? That sounds similar. It is not. How do we make this cheaper? Often pushes people towards reduction. Some even call it value engineering. Well, it is not. Cut this, compress that, negotiate harder, transfer risk, reduce scope, challenge fees, move faster. Sometimes those things are necessary. But what is making this expensive? Asks for diagnosis. Is it design complexity? Is it planning uncertainty? Is it financing cost? Is it risk allocation? Is it weak scope? Is it unclear ownership? Is it procurement misalignment? Is it excessive governance? Is it poor coordination? Is it market appetite? Is it insurance? Is it delay? Is it lack of internal client capability? Is it too many interfaces? Is it late decision making? Is it an asset that is being asked to satisfy too many different objectives? That diagnosis matters. Because the wrong cost response creates more costs. If the issue is unclear scope and you negotiate harder, you may simply force the contractor to protect themselves elsewhere. If the issue is planning uncertainty and you demand cost certainty, you may buy contingency. If the issue is poor coordination and you cut coordination effort, you make rework more likely. If the issue is weak client decision making and you appoint more advisors without improving ownership, you increase transaction density. If the issue is risk vagueness and you transfer risk, you increase price. Different causes need different responses. That is the practical point. Cost is not a single problem. It is a signal. And like most project signals, it has to be interpreted. A high cost may be waste. It may be risk. It may be uncertainty. It may be delay. Or poor decision maturity. It may be market conditions. It may be overprotection. It may be low trust. It may be governance weight. It may be capital structure. It may be the project honestly revealing what it takes to deliver under the conditions imposed on it. The last one is uncomfortable, because sometimes the cost is telling the truth, and the project simply does not like the truth, or people within it. Well, from my point of view, from the point of view of Bytnar, earlier visibility, better capability, and less theatre are like three things that I would like to concentrate on. And improving all of those three makes such a difference, we find. At Bytnar, the way we tend to look at this is quite grounded, I'd say. We're not trying to make projects artificially simple. Complex projects are complex. No doubt about that. The question is whether the complexity is understood, coordinated, and carried with enough capability on all sides, in all silos. Because when it is not, cost starts acting as a symptom. Cost tells you where uncertainty is sitting. Cost tells you where trust is weak. Cost tells you where decisions are late. Cost tells you where risk is vague. Cost tells you where the system is protecting itself. Cost tells you where the project has not yet become coherent. So a mature cost conversation needs more than price checking. It needs technical understanding. It needs commercial understanding. It needs delivery understanding. It needs behavioral understanding. It needs someone to ask, is this cost caused by the work or by the system around the work? That question can change the conversation. Because if the cost is in the work, you improve the work. If the cost is in the system, you gotta improve the system. And if the cost is uncertainty, you reduce uncertainty before demanding certainty. That is where early visibility becomes powerful. Not as a slogan, as practical discipline. Clarify the assumptions. Test buildability. Understand interfaces. Make risk specific. Align procurement with reality. Review design decisions before they harden. Strengthen client decision making. Reduce vague risk. Create better conversation before positions become defensive. None of that sounds glamorous, but it is where a lot of cost confidence actually comes from. Because projects do not become cheaper just because someone wants them cheaper. They become more controllable when the environment producing cost becomes more visible. That is the real move. From cost pressure to cost understanding. From price negotiation to system diagnosis. From late reaction to earlier visibility. From protecting positions to improving clarity. From asking only what is the number to asking what produced that number. And when that shift happens, people usually start seeing the project differently. Never perfectly, but more honestly. So let's return to the two identical houses, shall we? Let's say same size, same bricks, same roof tiles, same windows. One costs £300,000, the other costs £600,000. Where did the money go? Maybe some of it went into materials, maybe some went into labor, some went into design, maybe some went into market inflation. But maybe a lot of it went somewhere else. Into planning time, into financing cost, into professional advice, into insurance, into risk pricing, into legal structure, into delayed decisions, into governance, into protecting capital, into consultant interfaces, into rework, into uncertainty, into the cost of waiting, into the cost of people not trusting the same information at the same time, into the invisible layer around the building. And once you see that, the building looks different. Not physically, but economically. Because the project is no longer only a structure made of materials, It is a structure made of obligation, decisions, risks, approvals, relationships, funding assumptions, and protections. That is why the cost puzzle matters. If we keep treating cost as if it sits only in bricks and labor, we will keep missing where cost is actually created. And we will keep applying pressure at the wrong point. We will squeeze delivery while ignoring uncertainty. We will challenge contractors while leaving scope unclear. We will cut early advice while playing for late correction. We will demand certainty while feeding ambiguity into the system. We will call something inefficient when it may actually be overprotected, under-coordinated, or optimized for a different objective. The better conversation is harder, but more useful. What has this project been optimized to do? Protect capital, move quickly, minimize first cost, reduce liability, satisfy planning, preserve flexibility, control risk, create long-term value, because the answer matters. Every optimization has a cost. And if we do not name the optimization, we will misunderstand the cost. Okay, to summarize it all, how to close it? Well, UK construction is expensive for many reasons. Some are visible, some are not. Some are avoidable, some are structural. Some are caused by inefficiency, some are caused by protection. Some are caused by delay, some are caused by risk. Some are caused by the fact that we are asking projects to satisfy many different forms of certainty before anyone is allowed to build. And maybe that is the point. The question is not whether we need planning, insurance, finance, governance, regulation, or professional advice. We do. The question is whether the system around construction is creating enough clarity to justify the cost it adds. Because if a layer reduces uncertainty, improves decisions and protects outcomes, it may be valuable. But if a layer only moves risk, delays decisions, or creates the appearance of control, then it becomes part of the cost puzzle. And that is worth paying attention to. Because the future of construction is not only about building faster or cheaper, it is about understanding the systems that make building expensive in the first place. And once you start seeing those systems, you stop asking only where the money went. You start asking what the money was trying to protect. And whether there was a better way to create that confidence earlier. That is where I will leave this one. No need ending to it, just the reality to how these things tend to play out. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.